We are your home theater and AV questions answered. This is AVRant. Want your home theater or AV question answered by Tom and Rob? Send it to question@avrant.com.
Nick B. Nick is planning to have 2 rows of seating in his theater. The front row will be the primary row, and he likes the idea of a huge 50 to 55 degree field of view for enjoying CinemaScope and IMAX-sized features. He also likes the idea that we often say on AVRant of simply sitting in the second row when he wants a smaller field of view. So rather than masking the screen or, having dual screens, it's like, hey, you got 2 rows of seats.
Take a step back.
Yeah, you got to sit in the back row. Suddenly you got a smaller field of view. So he's planning a 7.2.4 speaker setup. It will be optimized for the first row. He is fine with the speaker positioning being slightly less than completely ideal when he's sitting in the second row. But since he personally will be using both rows, he'd still like the sound to be as good as possible for whichever row he is sitting in at the time. So are there any AV receivers or processors around the $2,000 mark or less that let you take 2 sets of room correction measurements? Of course, he'd be taking one with the front row as position number 1, and then a second set of measurements with the second row as position number 1, and then easily switch between those 2 with like just the push of a button.
I haven't heard of any. Have you?
Anthem will let you do this, but I doubt it's at $2,000. That's the problem. Oh dear, I have somehow James has dropped off this call, but I don't think that was the intention. In any case, we'll try and get James back.
Sorry about that. I lost you.
Not at all. Yep. So
So the internet.
So Anthem does have 2 slots for memories. They actually let you measure twice. So you save one measurement in slot 1 and a second measurement in slot 2. Their original idea was 1 measurement for movies and 1 measurement for music, which is silly. Sound is sound.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why you can't use it for this purpose, right? You take 1 measurement, you're starting position number 1 in the front row. The second measurement, you start position number 1 in the second row. So you can do that with Anthem, but it's the $2,000 price tag that won't let you do it. So the Denon and Marantz receivers and processors that we frequently recommend that have Odyssey Mult-EQ XT32, the receivers themselves can only store 1 set of measurements at a time.
Yep.
But what you can do is use their web interface to save that set of measurements.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Then you go and measure a second time in a, starting with mic position in a different location, and you can save that on your computer as a second set of measurements. Now, it's not as simple as what he wanted. You can't just push a button on your remote and switch between the 2. You have to use the web interface to load the set of measurements that you want to use, and it takes about 10 minutes to load that set of measurements. But at least you can do it for the price, and you can ultimately do what you want to do, which is have 2 separate sets of measurements that you switch between. It's just not as nearly as convenient as what you
have 2 receivers.
Yeah, you could. Well, but then connecting both of them to all the speakers.
Well, there is a connector out there that allow you to apply. It's a professional level, but you can apply. Attach 2 different amplifiers,
right,
and make a selection with one or the other to work.
Yeah, it's like a speaker selector switch, right?
But it's an isolator, yeah.
Yeah, a speaker selector switch for that. So
you could have 2 receivers, but that's expensive.
It's probably going to be more than $2,000 for 7.2.4 capability. Yeah, Emotiva with their XMC1, they still haven't released the Atmos /DTS:X firmware update that they've been promising now for about a year. So yeah, that's Emotiva.
Just a year?
That's Emotiva.
That's only been a year.
Still vaporware. Now, they use Dirac Live. It's a very similar situation to the Marantz and Denons, though. You can only store 1 set of measurements on the XMC1 itself. You can store multiple different measurements on your computer, right? But then you would still have to do the saving and loading of things. It's not a simple button press. So Anthem lets you do the button press, but not for the budget you want. Denon and Marantz and Emotiva, if and when they ever actually get that Atmos update. But Denon and Marantz, for sure, you can do it, but not with the simplicity of just a button press.
Yeah, sorry.
I know sometimes we don't
But
have.
you can split the difference on your sound and balance the audio in between the seats.
Yeah, or just realize that you prioritize for the front row, and then I mean, if there are people sitting in the back row, they're already hearing that
Yeah,
supposedly suboptimal sound. I mean, it's not going to be horrible back
it's
there.
not going to be suboptimal. It's going to be slightly different.
Slightly different, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So the easiest solution might be you just do it once.
Just do it once and then sit in the back seat. And if it's not bad, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Now, he does ask, we've talked about this Odyssey app that they mentioned when they first launched the current series of Den and AVRant receivers. Odyssey themselves is saying that that app is supposed to come out in March now, so we'll see if they actually hit that, but that's what they're claiming. Might that allow this type of switching between two measurements?
Not that I've heard of.
No, you wouldn't be able to switch between two completely separate sets of measurements. What you probably will be able to do is switch between at least two different target curves, because you can already do that with Odyssey, right? You can already switch between the reference target curve
Right.
and the flat target curve. The Odyssey app is supposed to let you manually choose your own target curve, like manually adjust your own
Right.
target curve. They'll probably let you switch between more than one target curve, but not more than one set of microphone measurement positions.
Right.
That's not going to be part of the app.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And yeah, I know it's all bad news, but it's like all kind of halfway there.
Like I said, it's gonna sound just different, not worse.
Yep. And so Nick's last question here for this week is, when it comes to overhead Atmos speakers, how does the bass management work? Nick was under the impression that any of the overhead speakers are always limited to about 150 hertz. So first of all, is that correct? And then do the subwoofers need to play up that high? And wouldn't that start to make the subwoofers localizable if they need to play that high? Or is there supposed to be like a gap in the frequency response between the overhead speakers and the subwoofers?
Well, that's kind of what the room EQ is for, is to manage all of those speakers. There's a frequency, and my understanding is there's a low frequency cutoff for those Atmos speakers, because you don't want all your bass going through them. But doesn't the Odyssey take care of all of the frequency crossovers for those speakers automatically?
Yeah, largely so. According to Dolby themselves in their home theater installation guideline for Atmos, if you're using physical in-ceiling or on-ceiling speakers, there's no hard cutoff at the bottom end. You could theoretically run them full range if they could do it, but they're treated like any other speaker. You can choose
Right.
any crossover frequency for those. So the first question you asked, like, are they always limited to 150 hertz or higher? No. If it's actual in-ceiling or on-ceiling speakers, they're not limited to that. You can use the normal 80 hertz crossover, and then there's really no issues with this. It's the upward firing Atmos enabled or Dolby Atmos modules that have the low frequency cutoff. And
Okay.
Dolby recommends about 150 hertz for those. They don't want the upward firing speakers playing any deep bass, because you're only going to hear direct sound at those frequencies. It's not going to bounce off the ceiling when you're starting to get that low. Those sounds are starting to become omnidirectional down there. So you're never going to be able to bounce those off the ceiling.
Right.
So they recommend, like, if you look at ELACs, they cut off at about 180. If you look at Klipsch's, they cut off at about 120. But it's, somewhere around that sort of 150 hertz mark. That's where that figure came from. It's for,
Okay.
it's for the upward firing speakers. In those cases, if you use the automatic setup like Odyssey or Y-Power or whatever, it will actually set the crossover for those, there, 120, 150, 180 hertz, and your subwoofers will be playing all the way up there for those sounds. Could that start to become localizable for your subs? Yeah,
Yeah,
theoretically.
potentially.
Yeah, but a lot of it has to do with how is the sound actually being mixed and mastered. Most of the audio objects that are meant to sound like they're discrete sounds coming from above you are mostly mid and high frequencies anyway, because those are the
Right.
directional localizable sounds. Part of Atmos, though, at home is 2 overhead channels, like actual channels, just like your 7 traditional channels around you. And sometimes movies have music or something playing out of those overhead channels, and because it's music or something that might be more full range. At that point, you might start to notice the subwoofers are taking over at a higher frequency. It's not impossible, but at the same time, usually when they use those overhead channels, it's more for an ambience effect, and that sound is also mixed into your surround and surround back speakers, which means it's sort of a amorphous, larger, enveloping sound, and you don't really.
So my question is this: when I get my Atmos receiver, when I set my speakers up in the ceiling, I'm resetting those to small.
Oh yes,
right,
yes.
So when I set my subwoofer, the small setting is usually automatically 80 hertz for me, as far as installing things.
Yep.
So that should pretty well cover those speakers as far as being protected from anything low frequency.
Yeah. And I mean, there's plenty of in-ceiling and on-ceiling speakers that can play nicely linearly down to 80 hertz. So it's just like any other speaker. They just happen to be on your ceiling. That's all.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's no hard limit.
Want your question answered? Send it to question@avrant.com. This is AVRant.
Now go out and listen to something.